Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talked with Thomas Ward about divine free will, focusing on Duns Scotus' view of divine free will and the act of creation.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Thomas Ward, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Baylor University. Tom specializes in the history of philosophy, especially in the medieval period, and he's interested in issues in metaphysics and philosophy of religion as well. He's published several books and articles, and several on John Duns Scotus. He's recently published a translation of and a commentary on Scotus's treatise on the first principle. That came out this year, that is 2024, with Hackett. He also has another book out this year on Boethius, which I've just actually ordered this morning, called After Stoicism, Last Words of the Last Roman Philosopher. That's published by Word on Fire Academic. One topic that Scotus and other medieval philosophers and theologians explore is that of God's free will. And we've asked Tom to join us today to talk about some of the philosophical and theological questions that surround the topic of divine freedom. So welcome to the show, Tom. Thanks so much for joining us. Could you start by telling our listeners a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on these issues in medieval philosophy and theology?
Yeah, sure thing. And thanks for having me on. Look forward to this conversation.
Me too.
Yeah, you said a lot of it. The SCOTUS stuff has probably been my main occupation as a scholar. My philosophical background is sort of one foot in the analytic philosophy world. I studied at UCLA, which is, sort of hardcore logic, philosophy of language sort of place. But then also one foot in the past, in the Middle Ages. And I sort of got there a little bit on accident. As an undergraduate, I had this wonderful, great books sort of general ed experience at my college, Biola University. And books like Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Plato's Republic and Augustine's Confessions and Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy were really just really, really inspiring to me. And then St. Thomas Aquinas as well, as a master of taking all of that classical wisdom and trying to make sense of it in light of his Christian faith. And so it just seemed like exactly the kind of intellectual project that would really inspire me for a lifetime. So I moved more and more in that historical direction, even as most of my major coursework was in contemporary analytic philosophy, and then from there my graduate school career sort of reflected both of those things. And it turns out I was just better at interpreting old texts from the past and trying to make philosophical sense of them than coming up with my own ideas. So the life of a historian of philosophy has suited me well.
Right.
Nice.
That's fun.
Well, our focus today is on divine freedom, but as we already noted, you've done a lot of work on medieval philosopher and theologian John Duns Scotus, and his views will probably come up several times in our discussion. For those unfamiliar with Scotus, could you tell us a bit about him and why his ideas are important for discussion today?
Yeah, and cut me off if I go on too long, but the hopefully the short and sweet introduction is that he lived from about 1265 to 1308. So second half of the 13th century, sort of a generation after Aquinas. Their lives overlapped for about 10 years. So that's sort of where you can put him on your timeline. He was a Franciscan friar and joined the order, about 3 generations in to the movement. After the Franciscans had really established themselves as intellectual players at the medieval universities, especially at Oxford and Paris, and Scotus studied at both of those universities, first at Oxford, and then was transferred to Paris to finish his basically doctoral work, and then took up a chair of Franciscan thought at the University of Paris. And one thing that's distinctive about Franciscans in general, medieval Franciscans in general, and Scotus in particular, is this emphasis on divine freedom, and they would probably put it primarily in terms of divine love. That the like the fundamental fact about the universe is that it was willed into existence by a God who did not have to do that. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
there is, in someone like Bonaventure, who was also a Franciscan, there is this sort of lingering Neoplatonic stuff about how the good is diffusive,
Mm-hmm.
and so creation sort of spills out of the diffusiveness of the good, and that can seem necessitarian, but whether or not Bonaventure leans that way, certainly the Franciscan tradition as a whole does not. And Scotus, I think, is the most systematic and rigorous of these Franciscan thinkers who are trying to make sense of um, both theologically and metaphysically
Mm-hmm.
what the God creature relationship is like, both in the sense of contingency in general, human free will, and the moral order. All of those things in light of divine freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And Scotus is of course famous for other things. Maybe his doctrine of Hexietes
Mm-hmm.
as the first metaphysician in the West, at least, to have such a view, and also very influential views in modal metaphysics, moving away from a broadly Aristotelian account of possibility as dependent on a temporal sequence to what's sometimes called a more synchronic account of possibility, where you can imagine multiple possibilities obtaining simultaneously, which sets the framework for, or it's the basic metaphysical innovation that you need in order to make sense, say, of like a possible worlds account of possibility,
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
or and necessity, where all of these possible worlds are represent possibilities obtaining atemporally or
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously. So Scotus is kind of a big deal in those ways, and then
Right.
there are also some distinctive views in theology. But
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's enough for now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thanks for that little bit of background. Well, this podcast has mostly been about issues related to human agency, though occasionally we've talked about other animals. And recently, in our conversation with Scott Davison about petitionary prayer, we talked a little bit about God's freedom. Um, Part of the reason so much of this podcast, the work we discuss, is focused on human free will is because of its connection to human practices of moral responsibility. Though some also take, human free will to matter for things like creativity, love, virtue, other things we take to be an important part of our lives. Since we're focused today on divine free will, could you tell us, maybe you've already hinted at this some in that last answer, but could you tell us a bit about why it might matter whether God has free will?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can approach it two ways. I mean, one is sort of from like a theology first or a God first perspective, and the other would be from a creation first perspective. So let's take the latter first.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we all, just about all of us, take it to be the case that some things come about contingently.
Mm-hmm.
That not everything that comes about necessarily,
Yeah.
and that is a really important feature of the world, important to us,
Right.
because we take among the things that come about contingently, so we hope at least, are many of our own actions. And if they were necessitated in some way, it's difficult. I know that there are ways of thinking through things like responsibility and meaning, even in a necessitated world. But I
Mm-hmm.
think, at least at the intuitive level, sort of pre-theoretical, something like, things happening contingently seems to be really important,
Mm-hmm.
if not required for genuine human agency of the sort that we care about. So then it's like, well, so what could explain contingency in general? And I think one quite good explanation is that that at the back of all things is a mind that and a will
Mhm.
that is the ultimate and sole cause of everything that happens, and it is able to bring its effects into existence contingently.
Mhm.
So, insofar as the world proceeds from a contingent first cause, or a first cause that causes contingently, then we have a world that's sort of itself, contingency is baked into it. There are
Mhm.
still further questions that arise about, well, okay, the existence of this particular world is contingent, but then do the things, is there some further or more robust sense in which at least some of the things that happen in this world come about contingently? But the ultimate explanation of just how there can be contingency in the first place is that the first principle of all things is a free agent.
Mhm.
So that would be the sort of bottom up, and
Right.
then the top down uh, is something like this. Something that I feel like I've learned from Scotus. So I'm about to say a pretty Scotist thing here, but something that I think it's something he got right, or at least something that I've come to accept, sort of on for my own in my own thinking. And the idea is this: um, that as much as possible, we want uh, the if you have a conception of God as the ultimate origin of everything, the good itself, or at least, if that language sounds weird, at least like the best possible thing, um, altogether worthy to be worshipped and to somehow orient one's life around, to like feel like the God is so important that it's worth living a religious life. Uh, all of that. So, given all this, like this very high view of what God is, we should want it to turn out uh, that God is independent in Himself from any fact about actual creatures or possible creatures. And that insight, this like divine independence, there's nothing besides God uh, must be, and that's not just a nice way to explain contingency in this world, but it's a
Right.
nice uh, attribute to attribute to the God that we think is worthy to be worshipped. And
Mhm.
so then, like something like divine freedom is an explanation of how God is. There are no facts about any possible creatures that constrain God to do anything, and this would include even sort of value facts, like the great goodness of human beings or angels or something like that. God
Mhm.
can be aware of the possibility of creating a world in which such important things come to exist, um, but is not moved by either by rationality or by goodness to do anything about that fact.
Mhm.
If He
Mhm.
does, then it just redounds to His liberality.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Interesting. One key way of differentiating types of views about free will is to distinguish between those that take freedom to be compatible with determinism and those that are incompatibilist. And part of the reason this makes sense in the human case is that we are the sorts of beings that could be causally determined to act in certain ways given the past or the laws of nature. But presumably, God is beyond the laws of nature, perhaps even beyond time. So, does it make sense to ask whether God's freedom is the sort that can be compatible or incompatible with determinism?
I, I let's see, how do I approach this question? It's to think of God's being determined to will or do anything. To me, has this sort of connotation of something external to God,
Yeah.
somehow supplying either a reason or a power that compels a certain kind of action
Mhm.
or willing on God's part. And so, in that sense, I think that no one could think of God's willing as being determined. And so, in that sense, there would not be the possibility of a compatibility between determinism and divine free will. But there's another sense of determinism that, it might be, that you would need to qualify the word so heavily that you'd want to like put an asterisk or something on it.
Yeah.
This other sort of determinism where it might make sense to talk about something necessarily proceeding from some facts about divinity itself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And what I have in mind here is something like God's recognition of his own goodness and his own worthiness to be loved, and out of that, perfect intellectual recognition of his own nature, then something like an elicited act of self-love would follow. It couldn't help but follow. And so it's like determined by the facts of his own nature, say, to love himself. So that's an act of willing, like a sort of perpetual willing of his own good, such that anything he does, whether with respect to creation or only internal to himself, is for the sake of his own, in some sense, for his own sake. So this sort of necessary self-love, I think, would be an example of a kind of determinism star that we might, that I think I would feel comfortable attributing to God. And now, I say that as someone who, with respect to human free will, not as someone who's an expert in the subject, but I have a sort of strong intuition that compatibilism is not the strong intuition against compatibilism in the human case. There's this. If I could talk about this for like just a little bit more, there's this debate that goes on in the Middle Ages about to what extent is human willing connected to the good necessarily, and then the good in what sense. And the sort of limit case of this discussion concerns what's called the beatific vision. If we're all in heaven, and somehow God is presented to the intellect in so powerful a way that we can't help but recognize that loving God is the most desirable and choice-worthy thing to do. What follows from that? One side of the debate said that what follows from that is that the will is necessarily moved to love God, right, in that circumstance where God is presented to the intellect as unqualifiedly good. And then another side of the debate, on which Scotus was that no, even in that case, the will remains free to withhold its loving assent. And it's always struck me that if you abandon, like Scotus did, if you abandon that connection to goodness in that limit case, then we really start down a pretty crazy road. So I want to hold on to this sort of broadly Thomistic insight, actually, that although in general, like in almost every case, we're incompatibilists, in this one case, because of the way in which human willing is oriented by nature to the good, where there is an unqualifiedly perfect good represented to the intellect, then we can't help but love it, and that's the sort of perfection of willing rather than a degrading of willing.
Yeah,
I know my guess is that all probably sounds crazy relative to the so we know whatever you want to pick up from there, and but yeah, those are some thoughts. I don't know what y'all make of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting suggestion. And I guess one thing it makes me think of in the contemporary free will debate is Susan Wolf's view that there's kind of an asymmetry in whether the freedom to do otherwise is necessary for praise on the one hand and for blame on the other. And she even uses capital G good in her way of portraying the kind of freedom I think you're talking about in the divine case, or maybe with the beatific vision, where you don't really need the freedom to sort of fall away from the good, to be free in doing the right thing and being praiseworthy for it. But then when it comes to, to evils, right, the freedom to do otherwise is necessary for us to be blameworthy. So we had an interview with her. I can't remember which season it was in, but people could go and check that out for a kind of, a secular version of that in the contemporary free will
Yeah.
debate.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I should check that out. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Maybe to use some other kind of terminology from the contemporary free will debate, which we can leave behind if we want, but maybe it'll be helpful for thinking about some of these issues. Another way of talking about different types of free will is to distinguish between leeway views, which is kind of like that view I was just mentioning, where you need the freedom to do otherwise, and then sourcehood views, on the other hand, which really emphasize that the action stems appropriately from the agent as the source. Do you think either one of these approaches is better than the other when it comes to divine freedom?
I think in the God case, we need both. And so, I mean, in the the sourcehood view, well, put it this way: if you think that God is truly the first thing, then there's no explanation outside God about why God does whatever God does. So in that sense, he's not only the source of his own actions, but the only source.
Yeah,
right.
There's no causal input needed to activate whatever sourcehood he himself has. The leeway it's really interesting in the God case, because I was talking earlier about this idea of God sort of necessarily willing his own good.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could say, could God do otherwise? No. So then there's no leeway there. But then with respect to anything else that God might do, there is supposed to be lots of leeway. There's no such thing on the views that I'm most attracted to as a best possible world. So if you take that sort of Leibnizian instinct that perfectly good and rational God, if God creates at all, would somehow need to create the best possible world. I deny that, because not really out of any tuitions about divine goodness or rationality, but because I can't get my mind around the concept of a best possible world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If you think, for example, that worlds either are somehow finite in themselves or include finite things, as I think all you would need is the idea that there are some finite things in the world, and then I can ask, can they be arranged better? Could any of the finite things be made at least a little bit better, and still preserve whatever good arrangement is supposed to supervene on all these things? And I think to say that at some point you would be forced to say, no, we're done. This is as good as it gets. Like I have no sympathy for that view. So then it's like, well, with respect to the question whether God can create or not create, and then given some sort of desire to create or intention to create, whether God can create one world rather than another world, and how many possibilities are open to God. There, I think the possibilities are almost endless, and so we understand divine freedom in this leeway sense with respect to divine willing of creatures, but then also, but not with respect to his own willing, his own self-willing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure. Well, yeah, no, maybe just sort of pause there. And so as I'm sort of working with these leeway versus sourcehood, are the reflections that I'm giving, are they sort of tracking some of the issues at stake in this distinction?
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and even the idea of God having to will sort of his own good, but not being, the source of that isn't traceable to something external to him. That sounds a lot like the sourcehood view. But then, yeah, when you're talking about the decision to create, or what world to create, you can see how leeway would fit in there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And these aren't represented in the contemporary discussions as incompatible, right? I mean, I could see how someone might accept one and reject the other, but
Right.
There's not supposed to be anything incompatible about them. So you could say both.
That is true. Yes. And actually, a lot of the people who have made the distinctions emphasize that they want to capture both. But
Yeah.
often, at least in the case of human free will, there's either an emphasis or a priority on one over the other.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people see, I don't know, debates about Frankfurt cases and that sort of thing, whether alternative possibilities are needed for responsibility, as a debate about whether, and maybe to what extent, leeway is needed to either understand appropriate sourcehood or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't think they're exclusive.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Many theologians in the Christian tradition have insisted that God must have free will, at least with respect to the decision about whether to create the world. And you've already mentioned this a little bit. But what are some reasons for thinking that creation must be the result of this free choice on God's part?
My own approach to this has to do with the finitude of creation, and in particular finitude in value. That it's the fact that any possible world is finite in value, and that there's no best possible world, suggests to me that God isn't constrained as a sort of condition on preserving his own goodness to create anything at all. Now, because how might one sort of nitpick that? I mean, if sort of if it makes sense on a theistic framework to think about like the overall state of things that is somehow inclusive of God and anything else that exists, then your intuitions might start running in the direction of, well, isn't it kind of mean of God, stingy of God, not to make things in general, overall, at least a little bit better, because you get his infinite goodness plus whatever goodness a created order would contribute to the overall state of things. And I know this is half baked, but there's something that strikes me as a little odd about thinking of God plus anything else as representing some sort of total sum of value, like total sum, like in what? I don't want to say the universe, because I don't think of God as being in the universe. I'm not sure I can sort of comfortably represent to myself something like a total universe of discourse, which somehow includes God and everything else in it. I want to sort of keep this separate. So I'm not sure that, despite the fact that at first glance it does seem intuitively, maybe even obvious, that if you have God and then God makes something, then there is more goodness, or at least more good things. If any of the things that God makes is good. And so why wouldn't God do that? But I'm not, this isn't an argument, but I just don't find myself drawn in that direction when I think about what's supposed to be the radical difference between God and creatures. And you might, and another way of approaching this is God in himself is enough. There is no lack that God has some need to rectify. Maybe that just begs the question, but if you're sort of thinking of God as a totally perfect being, or like in a Thomistic framework as pure actuality, then there's nothing that then maybe you do start losing your intuitive grasp on God somehow acting better if he makes a world as opposed to not making a world.
Mm-hmm.
But I freely admit that all of those reflections are pretty half baked and definitely would need to be buttoned down. So the short answer to the question is it's the limited value that any world represents that makes God, gets God off the hook, so to speak, as a condition on his rationality or goodness for creating it.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you've gone that far, then the choice between various possible worlds, of course, God is going to have discretion there. And, probably this is an interesting puzzle, the sort of these threshold problems. Is there a world so bad that God couldn't make it? Is there a world so good that God would have to make it? I've already
Mm-hmm.
said what I think about the latter, but with respect to the former, I mean, I think that my own view is that it's actually broadly logically impossible for God to create like a truly horrific world.
Mm-hmm.
And you think, well, it's easy to imagine a truly horrific world, and well, is it? I mean, if you think that for there to be a world, there must be a God who brought that world into existence, then I think what you have to conceive is God creating a horrific world.
Right.
And I think that's where you find the broadly logical impossibility.
Mm-hmm.
Not, if you sort of somehow try to leave out the fact that the world needs to have an origin, then maybe you can conceive it because we have mental pictures of really bad things and we can just stick a lot together. But once you start thinking of that thing as metaphysically in need of actualization, then I'm not sure. So really the only possible worlds are worlds that are good enough to exist by the agency of a perfectly good God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I've said this on this podcast, definitely when I've been on other podcasts, that like the issue of divine freedom, and especially thinking about God in, the decision to create is sort of, for me, sort of like the part of my views on free will that are the least well developed that I haven't thought
Yeah,
through. So this is helpful for me, but I still don't know what to think at the end of the day.
yeah, it's hard.
We wanted to also make sure to ask specifically about Scotus and his view of divine freedom. I'm sure we've touched on this some, but how does Scotus account for God's freedom in creation?
Yeah. So just to draw together a few things that have already come out, and I actually would love to just sort of raise a puzzle of my own that might actually be a kind of modest criticism of Scotus.
Mm-hmm.
So you start with this picture of God's independence of anything outside of himself. So it's metaphysically possible that God was the only thing
Mm-hmm.
in existence. Or it is metaphysically possible that God is the only thing in existence, or was. Leave that aside.
Yeah.
So then we can imagine God's having this, active willing himself for all eternity, and that, as we've noted earlier, I take to be somehow necessary. Like God couldn't become unhappy with himself or restless, because he couldn't. Maybe could he wish himself to be less perfect so that he could work on, so he could have like a project to work on, a project of self-improvement. I don't know. I guess suppose, but if I start with a sort of highly metaphysical view of God rather than a more like person, just like thinking of things that we value about human persons and then just trying to like blow them up onto God. And so I'm not so moved by this thought that maybe God could sort of wish things to be otherwise in a way that would wish like things about himself to be otherwise, such that he would be wishing for himself to be less perfect than he actually is. That doesn't seem fitting somehow for God. And so we have this necessary act of self-willing and then totally contingent act of creation. And so my puzzle is that Scotus, in general, when it comes to human freedom, thinks that part of what it is to have a free will is to be totally undetermined in what one wills. So the thought is this: it's not as though there's no like causal network in which you have to be placed in order to elicit an act of willing. You still need ultimately God's concurring, sustaining activity in order to produce an act of will. But so the point is not that acts of willing are somehow totally uncaused.
Right.
It's that given some causal input sufficient for an act of willing, what is willed is up to the agent. And Scotus is so committed to this idea that even in the beatific vision case, God perfectly presented to the intellect, the willing there is still not determined to adhere to God in love. Now, Scotus recognizes one religious problem with that, which is that perfect beatitude is supposed to involve a kind of security in the perpetuity of beatitude. And so if you knew about yourself that you had this power to like withdraw from God, to stop loving God, that would make you a little bit anxious. And so what Scotus resolves this not by changing his view of free will, but by saying that God has this gives us this grace of firmitas, a firmness of will that renders us incapable of falling away. So it's quite interesting. You know, the Thomists need to explain some sort of divine imparting of the capacity for beatitude, and Scotus and the Scotists think that we need some sort of divine imparting of the capacity not to fall away from beatitude. So their accounts of the relationship between nature and grace both have these sort of gaps that require a special divine activity. But in any case, the point is that strictly speaking, the will remains the very power that it is, even in beatific vision, and that involves not being compelled to will what it wills. All right. So given that picture of freedom, and Scotus seems so strongly committed to this, right. It's like what the power of willing is. Then here's the puzzle. It's like, well, how can he say that in the God case, God, in necessarily willing his own goodness, is doing that freely? Right. You know, it's not as though, well, God isn't free to do otherwise. No, Scotus wants to say that this is a free action on God's part because it proceeds from his willing. It's what he wants to be doing. It's just that he couldn't do otherwise. So how does Scotus feel like he can help himself to these two accounts of freedom? You know, if he thinks that in the God case we can admit freedom without alternative possibilities, why not just hold that in the human willing, you know, maybe in general because of the inadequacy of our knowledge, we always have this great latitude, but in the limit case of beatific vision, you know, the will's activity is necessitated, but still free because it's the perfection of willing. To me, as far as I can tell, and I haven't read every word of Scotus, and Scotus is hard, and so maybe I don't understand. And if some Scotus scholars end up listening to this podcast, maybe I'll get an angry letter saying, "Are you dummy? This is obvious." But it doesn't. I don't have an answer to this in Scotus. So I think that, you know, in general, Scotus is such a great systematician, and doesn't want, unlike Occam, doesn't want to just do ad hoc solutions in the God cases just to sort of save this coherence of religious language,
Yeah.
and then just does his own thing, with respect to anything in metaphysics or epistemology with respect to creatures. In general, Scotus does not. His method is not to separate sort of methodologies when
Right.
it comes to God, but here I think I think he made a mistake.
That's interesting.
Does Scotus, so when you said that when the beatific vision is presented to the intellect, some of the medievals thought that you just had to accept it, and Scotus
Yeah.
is saying no, you don't have to. Was there any explanation? So, like in contemporary action theory, sometimes we think about the cognitive aspects, like beliefs, and then there's also like desire, non-cognitive, affective kinds of mental states. And so, to have an action, you have to have both of these. So you have a belief that this thing is the right thing to do, and you have this desire that you want to do this thing. So are these both part of the intellect for Scotus? Does he recognize the difference between these two? So I could imagine like an example of like how this is possible of the beatific vision being presented to a person who hates God and then rejects him.
Yeah. In the hatred of God case, you could imagine a sort of hatred proceeding out of like misunderstanding,
Mhm.
So, think about, sometimes people today talk about religious trauma. Let's say you were, you had, I don't know, parents who were really strict about religion, but then were horrible to you all the time. And so you end up associating anything to do with religion with being abused. And so then it seems like, gosh, we understand why you're not interested in God. And so you say, yep, if such a person were to say, I hate God, we should take them seriously. But at the same time, think, well, but if they only knew, like,
Mhm.
then we wouldn't automatically, I don't think we would automatically suppose that such a person had, it was God under the description of the ruler that my horrible parents said was going to judge me or something like that. Then it hates that. But that's not a good description to have to think God under. So if God were to graciously present himself to the intellect of such a person, maybe we would think, yeah, there would still be a disposition to love God, to recognize, oh, this is what it's really all about. My parents were wrong. But you can imagine a stronger sort of hatred. Lucifer's sort of supposed hatred, where we imagine Lucifer setting his will against what God wants in
Yeah.
this, character forming way. Despite the fact that he was once in a position to recognize that God really is the good, and somehow came to hate that fact. Yeah, so could God sort of get through to Satan by presenting himself to Satan in a way that Satan couldn't say no? That's tricky. I think what you'd have to suppose is that God would have to change some things about Satan's psychology, and you ask, could God do that? And I would think, yeah, even if Satan doesn't want that to happen, I don't think that fact would be any sort of constraint on God. God might have set things up in such a way that he freely chooses not to do certain things to our psychology to keep us adequately free or something like that. But so that's a really hatred of God is really interesting to think through in the beatific vision case. But the more generally, these medieval guys operate with what is sometimes called a faculty psychology, on which the what we would call the mind or the soul is characterized by two fundamental powers, intellect and will, and then every what we might think of as like every possible experience or phenomenon either is referred to those two powers, or is referred to something like conditions of our being in a body. So certain kinds of passions that are bodily experience, at least experienced, at least in part, as bodily experiences. Those are supposed to arise from our the fact that we're sensitive agents. So the beatific vision is supposed to be a kind of completion of both intellect and will. So you get like, there's this, we're thinking in a sort of teleological universe, right? So what is the intellect? It's that power by which we are inclined to the true.
Mm-hmm.
What is the will? It's that power by which we are inclined to the good. And so God is the ultimate source of intelligibility. God is perfectly desirable, totally actual, and so perfect, not just perfect in a species, but perfection as such. And so somehow suitably presented to a human agent, the power of intellect is perfected and the power of willing is perfected. That's the sort of basic view.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Matt, I lost the thread of the original question.
Yeah, the question was just about like these two things, like beliefs on one hand about facts or truths, and then desires.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of captured by intellect and will.
Yeah.
Different. I'm not sure if it's just a terminological difference or if there's actual like difference in content about what contemporary action theorists are talking about with belief and desire.
Yeah. I mean, the question of whether something like desire is cognitive or not is I think, probably is really interesting and relevant here. I mean, we could think about desires maybe in like when we're thinking about what the medieval Aristotelians would call like our sensitive appetites, feelings of hunger and stuff like that. Are those non-cognitive? Maybe they can be, because you can imagine someone like feeling hunger pains and being ignorant about nutrition, and so not knowing so there would be some sort of appetite, maybe, maybe you'd still feel just the discomfort of the hunger, but not know that it's directed at something without a cognitive component. But I think, so certain cases aside, in general, I think that the medieval picture is that the will is it's an appetite for the good, but I think it must be characterized in cognitivist terms, because it's in need of being its appetite is sort of mediated through the intellect. It doesn't have some like immediate apprehension of its object. It's always relativized to what we know or believe about whatever it is that we're desiring.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think would it make sense to say that if all of that is the case about even someone like Scotus, who leans a little bit more voluntaristic, that would be a sort of cognitivist view of desiring? Would that be a correct way to use the terminology, or not?
Yeah, I actually was not intending to emphasize the cognitive, non-cognitive aspect as much as just like sometimes it's described in terms of direction of fit. Like your beliefs, the direction of fit is like you want to change your beliefs to fit with the way the world actually is.
Mm-hmm.
And with desires, you want to change the world to match what your desires are. Like if there's no food in my belly, I want to change that and make the world a little bit different.
Yeah, that's quite nice. Yeah, that's quite nice. I think that, wow. Again, in the limit case of beatific vision, I suppose there would be a merging of these, a perfect harmonization where, that Scotus and others who are inspired by various things that Saint Anselm says will say something like this: that kind of moral perfection, probably not to be achieved in this life, is something like willing what God wants us to will as God wants us to will it. So if your character has been formed in that perfect sort of way, then you want then your desiring is not autonomous. It's you've recognized God as the one who has authority over even your willing, and so you sort of place your willing subordinate to God's willing, and so there's no longer this. I don't think it quite makes sense to think of willing as a sort of desire to change things. It's desire to be changed in the right sort of way by God, but in doing so, we're not being servile or stupid, because we can recognize God as the one who is more worth following than our own desires are worth, our unformed or unperfected desires are worth following. But outside of the limit case, I think that that's a quite nice distinction, and I want to think about that more. Thanks for that.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, thank you, Tom, for joining us. This has been a really interesting conversation. Like I said, these are things that I'm constantly kind of working through, and I'll probably go back and listen to this episode several times. For those that are interested in reading some of your work or following you, where can listeners go to follow your work?
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed the conversation too. I have if you want to just see what I've written, I have a website. I publish as Thomas M. Ward, Thomas with a TH. And so my website is just thomasmward.com. So you can go see what I'm up to. And thanks for mentioning the Boethius book. That just came out last week, and it's sort of more of like the product of a teacher than the product of a scholar. There's some scholarly stuff I do, but it's really sort of more aimed at inspiring and rather than like engaging the Boethius scholarship.
Right.
So I hope you enjoy it. And then, if anyone got interested in the Duns Scotus stuff, I did write an introductory book on Scotus a couple of years ago called Ordered by Love, an introduction to John Duns Scotus. So you can check that out and learn more about Scotus, including the stuff about divine freedom and human freedom. There's more about human freedom than we got out today that I think your listeners might be pretty interested in.
Yeah.
And that you mentioned the treatise on the first principle. That's a super technical book. So I mean, only go there if you're like really want to get in the weeds in philosophical theology. That's a hard book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thanks again, Tom.
Yeah. Great.
In our next episode, we'll talk about free will in heaven, and our guest will be Benjamin Matheson, assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Bern.